The chandeliers of Heverly House glowed with a restrained golden warmth, their light caught in 100 facets of crystal and gilt. It was not a large party, nor a particularly noisy one. Lady Hermione Vale did not approve of noise unless it came from a string quartet, and tonight she had engaged a competent one. They played a light arrangement of Mozart, which drifted through the drawing room like scented smoke. Guests moved through the space with the quiet deliberation of those conscious of belonging to a well-bred scene. A painter of modest fame stood beside a general of considerable reputation. A pair of young socialites whispered behind their fans. An elderly scholar attempted to describe to a half-interested debutante the theological significance of a medieval prayer book recently unearthed in Dorset. All of it had the polished veneer of upper-class civility, a veneer that, to an attentive observer, shimmered faintly at the edges. Inspector Roderick Alleyn was not, of course, attending in any professional capacity. Lady Hermione had invited him because she enjoyed the company of intelligent men, and because the presence of a detective of his elegance lent an air of subtle excitement to a gathering otherwise prone to polite stagnation. Alleyn was well aware of this, but he did not mind. He accepted a glass of champagne from a footman with a discreet bow and allowed himself a moment to observe the room. It was a habit of his, almost a ritual, the silent cataloguing of faces, gestures, tensions beneath the social hum. The painter, a thin, romantic-looking man named Adrian Frollo, stood too close to the actress Miss Delphine Gray, whose smile was lovely but brittle, as though rehearsed. Across the room, Lord and Lady Avelton conducted a muted skirmish beneath the guise of genteel conversation, their expressions polite, their fingers white at the knuckles. The scholar, Dr. Peniston, stooped lower and lower over his lecture to the debutante, who stared at him with wide, helpless eyes. Alleyn's gaze passed over each in turn, noting without effort the tiny dissonances. A strained smile here, a suppressed sigh there. Nothing unusual for such a gathering, but a constellation of private tensions nevertheless. Lady Hermione swept toward him, her gown rustling like silk pages turning. She was a tall woman of commanding grace, with eyes that suggested she found life amusing but humanity disappointing. "My dear Inspector," she said, offering her hand, "you look criminally thoughtful. Do tell me you're not analyzing my guests." "Only admiring them," Alleyn replied with courteous ease. "You've assembled a charmingly varied group, a minor United Nations of personal intrigue." Lady Hermione's eyebrow lifted. "If there is intrigue, my dear Alleyn, it is tragically domestic. Nothing so delicious as espionage. Not unless one counts Adrian's hopeless devotion to Delphine, which she reciprocates only when the newspapers take notice." Alleyn smiled. "A predictable arrangement." "Predictable people can still wreak havoc," she murmured. "Do have another drink. The champagne is excellent. Or so I'm told. It seems to be the only thing in this household that behaves predictably." She moved on, pausing to direct a footman's attention toward a guest whose empty glass had become, in her estimation, unbecoming. Alleyn's eyes followed the footman, Mr. Larch, Lady Hermione's impeccably correct but somewhat anxious butler. Larch handled the champagne tray with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Across the room, Lord Avelton raised his voice slightly. Not enough to create a scene, merely enough for Alleyn's trained ear to discern the edge behind the civility. "My dear, one might think you prefer Adrian's company to mine," Avelton said with a thin smile. Lady Avelton tilted her head, her pearls trembling faintly. "Adrian speaks about something other than your regiment, William. A married woman must diversify her conversational diet." The general stiffened. "I did not realize you found me monotonous." "Oh, William," she sighed, "you never realize anything." Miss Delphine Gray turned at that moment and caught the exchange over her shoulder. Her expression flickered with something like satisfaction before she returned her attention to Adrian Frollo, who appeared to be describing in poetic terms a recent painting. Alleyn took a slow sip of champagne. It was good, very good. But he found himself contemplating Lady Hermione's odd remark, the only predictable thing in the household. Why that, of all comments, lingered in his mind he could not have said. A cluster of laughter erupted near the ballroom's threshold, the forced, uncertain laughter of people guarding themselves. A toast was proposed to Lady Hermione, glasses lifted with rehearsed enthusiasm. Mr. Larch circulated dutifully, the silver tray glinting like a moonlit pond. Alleyn observed all of it with gentle detachment. Not suspicion, merely that quiet awareness that years in his profession had ingrained in him. The awareness that in any elegant room there were stories concealed beneath each polished surface. But tonight was only a party, a pleasant one if slightly strained. It was not until much later, when the laughter had softened, when the quartet played a final delicate phrase, when Lady Hermione's voice drifted through the fading hum, that one guest would lift a glass of champagne, pause, and in a moment of almost polite silence, collapse with startling gentleness onto the polished floor. But that moment had not yet come. For now, the evening shimmered with light, civility, and a dozen quiet cracks below the surface. The soft strains of the quartet had ceased, leaving the room in a hushed resonance, the kind that makes every small sound seem amplified. Footsteps on the polished floor, the clink of a spoon against a silver tray, the faint rustle of silk gowns. All were more pronounced in the attentive silence. It was then that Mr. Larch noticed the stillness. Miss Delphine Gray had been speaking to Adrian Frollo moments before, a delicate smile upon her lips, but now she was oddly motionless, her glass poised at mid-air. Larch, ever vigilant, moved closer. Lady Hermione, across the room, noticed first the subtle change in the general atmosphere, a sudden tautness, like the strings of a violin pulled too sharply. She glanced toward the center of the drawing room and saw Delphine Gray reclining unnaturally against the carpet, her champagne glass fallen at her side, the golden liquid spilling in a small, serene pool. No cry, no convulsive movement, only the faint, eerie stillness of a body that had surrendered its rhythm. The guests, uncertain whether to intervene or merely observe, clustered at the edges of the room. Some whispered, some simply stared. Alleyn, who had been lingering near the mantelpiece, gave a faint, almost imperceptible sigh. He did not rush, did not disturb the delicate choreography of reactions. Instead, he stepped forward with deliberate calm, allowing his eyes to take in every detail, the angle of Miss Gray's head, the slight pallor of her complexion, the almost imperceptible tension in her hands. "She's asleep," whispered Adrian Frollo, though even in his uncertainty, his voice carried a note of dread. "No," Alleyn said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Not asleep." Lady Hermione, moving with her usual poise, approached the body and knelt. Her hand hovered near Delphine's wrist, as if checking for some pulse that she already feared would not be there. Her lips were a thin line. "Call for the doctor," Alleyn instructed softly, turning now to the assembled guests, whose faces ranged from shock to fascination. "And clear the room, please. Calm is preferable to hysteria." As Mr. Larch hurried to obey, Alleyn observed the expressions of those present. Some were masked with concern, others with calculated composure, but beneath every polite exterior lay a fragile quiver of tension. He noted particularly Lord Avilton, whose hand tightened on Lady Avilton's elbow, and Adrian Frollo, whose gaze seemed to fracture under the weight of unuttered guilt or confusion. There was something remarkable in the quiet of the death. It demanded attention not by spectacle, but by the very absence of it. No overturned chairs, no shattered glass beyond the single fallen champagne flute, no frantic screams. Only the slow, dawning awareness that elegance itself could not shield one from tragedy. Alleyn knelt briefly beside Miss Gray, his expression still controlled, his hands steady. He touched her wrist. Indeed, nothing. He observed the champagne glass, the subtle residue along the rim, and the faint odor, delicate yet slightly bitter, that seemed to cling to the golden liquid. Nothing overt, he murmured, rising and letting his eyes roam once more. But everything, as always, is in the details. He glanced at Lady Hermione. Please ensure that no one leaves until I have spoken to them individually. Every guest, every member of the household in turn. Politeness remained paramount, even in the presence of death. Yet in the understated elegance of this household, Alleyn could already sense fissures forming, the carefully maintained social veneer cracking under the weight of unease. The doctor arrived promptly, nodding curtly to Alleyn before kneeling to examine the body. After a measured moment, he straightened. No obvious external trauma. Appears sudden, 'cause, well, it is too early to say. Alleyn's gaze drifted past the doctor to the room itself, the paintings, the gilded furniture, the careful arrangement of flowers. Everything in its place. Everything perfectly normal. Everything hiding something. And in that quiet room, with a body that did not scream and a champagne glass as if complicit in its silence, the mystery of Miss Delphine Gray's death began to unfurl. Slowly, subtly, and entirely within the invisible margins of civility. The drawing room had emptied under Alleyn's quiet direction, leaving only a few essential figures. Lady Hermione, Mr. Larch, the doctor, and, of course, himself. The remaining guests were gathered in the adjacent salon, murmuring among themselves in muted tones. The sounds carried faintly, like echoes filtered through velvet, revealing more in hesitation than in words. Alleyn did not immediately summon anyone for questioning. Instead, he stood in the center of the room, surveying the scene as if it were a painting to be deciphered. The spilled champagne, the delicate tilt of the fallen glass, the slight indentation of Miss Gray's head against the carpet. All spoke to him in the quiet language of observation. Lady Hermione moved beside him, her expression composed, though her fingers were pressed lightly together. "I cannot imagine who would wish her harm," she murmured. "Nor can I," Alleyn said softly. "But wishing harm and achieving it are rarely coincident. And in a house such as this, where every gesture is rehearsed, accidents are seldom accidental." He allowed his eyes to drift over the faces of those who had departed to the salon. In their polite distance, Alleyn noted the subtle signals. Lord Avelton's hands, now clasped behind his back, tapping ever so slightly. Lady Avelton's smile, fixed and precise. Adrian Frollo's eyes, flickering between his companions, never resting in peace. People revealed themselves. Alleyn said more to himself than to Lady Hermione, not through confession, but through the impossibility of perfection. One cannot maintain polish when the heart trembles. Mr. Larch, who had lingered near the threshold, cleared his throat. "Shall I fetch Miss Gray's personal effects, sir?" Alleyn inclined his head. "Yes, but leave them where they can be observed first. Order is as revealing as disorder. One often sees more from the way a man or a woman arranges her small belongings than from any conversation." While Larch moved quietly to comply, Alleyn's gaze returned to the paintings on the walls. Landscapes, portraits of distant ancestors, and a small, still life of fruit and crystal, all carefully placed. Yet in each, he observed tiny distortions of intention, a brush stroke too harsh, a frame slightly askew. Nothing criminal, perhaps, but everything indicative of character. Alleyn's attention then settled on Adrian Frollo, who had lingered at the doorway, ostensibly to oversee the removal of the body, but clearly unable to disengage from the scene. The painter's hands fidgeted with a cufflink. His gaze darted to the carpet, then to the door, then to Lady Hermione, and back again. Alleyn said nothing, merely noted the rhythm of his anxiety. "Mr. Alleyn," Lady Hermione murmured, "how do you do it? You see so much, yet say so little. It is unnerving. Alleyn permitted a faint smile, courteous and restrained. Observation is neither heroic nor unnerving, Lady Hermione. It is merely attention without haste, without the desire to impose judgment before understanding. Everything worth knowing will, in time, reveal itself, often in silence. He stepped closer to the fallen glass, noting its delicate etching and the small smudge of lipstick along the rim. Even in this small detail, he sensed a story, a fragment, incomplete, yet significant. He did not speak it aloud. It was too early. Premature revelation served no one. The doctor, having completed his cursory examination, straightened and murmured, "No external injury. Heart? Perhaps. Poison? I cannot say at a glance. A sample is required." Alleyn nodded. "Quite so. Thank you, Doctor. We shall see." He turned back to the room and let his eyes drift over the quiet, watching the servants who moved with subtle, almost rehearsed efficiency, and the spaces they left behind. In the orderly world of Haverley House, disorder was like a shadow. Sometimes long, sometimes short, but always present. Alleyn's thoughts were not yet of accusation, but of understanding, of character, of subtle interaction, of what each individual desired but would not speak. He had never believed in violence as a revelation. Rather, it was a lens, revealing fractures beneath civility, tensions hidden beneath politeness. And here, in this gently illuminated room, with spilled champagne and unspoken distress, those fractures were already beginning to whisper. Alleyn's next steps, as always, would be quiet. Observation first, questions second. Only in that measured way could the truth emerge without losing the elegance of circumstance. By the time Alleyn returned to the salon, the remaining guests had settled into a strained civility. Tea had been poured and placed upon silver trays, though few touched it. It was more a gesture of propriety than desire. The soft murmur of polite conversation persisted, but under it lay the nervous undercurrent of a house uncertain of its own calm. Alleyn began with Adrian Frollo, who hovered near a window, his hands still restless. The painter's voice was low, hesitant, careful not to betray either ignorance or knowledge. "Mr. Frollo," Alleyn said, bowing slightly, "you were speaking with Miss Grey not long before—" He allowed the sentence to drift, uncompleted. "Yes, Inspector," Adrian replied, clearing his throat. "We were discussing a painting. She wished to commission a portrait of Lady Hermione, though." He faltered, then added, "I cannot imagine why anyone would harm her." Alleyn studied him in silence, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the way his gaze shifted to the carpet. "And yet," Alleyn murmured, "people sometimes achieve what they cannot imagine. You understand the distinction?" "I suppose I do," Adrian admitted. "But it seems impossible." Alleyn inclined his head, offering no reassurance. "Impossible, perhaps. Improbable, certainly. But the improbable sometimes chooses a very refined moment to announce itself." He moved on to Lord and Lady Avelton, seated together on a faintly threadbare sofa. Their expressions were impeccably polite, yet both betrayed an undercurrent of irritation, subtle, carefully contained. "Lord Avelton," Alleyn began. "Miss Grey seemed fond of social conversation, though she did not speak freely with everyone. Were you aware of any disputes between her and any of the guests tonight?" Lord Avelton's lips curved into a practiced smile. "My dear Inspector, in polite society, one rarely speaks of disputes in front of other guests. Would that we all preserved such civility." Alleyn noted the slight tightness in Lady Avelton's hands as she rested them on her lap. "Indeed. And yet, sometimes civility conceals more than it reveals. Your wife seems remarkably composed." Lady Avelton tilted her head, her smile polite but distant. "One learns, Inspector, that composure is an excellent ally. especially when one wishes to avoid scandal. Alleyn allowed a quiet nod. Scandal was rarely absent from the grand houses of England. It simply hid beneath lace, silver, and careful diction. The scholar, Dr. Penistone, presented a different challenge. He was earnest, oblivious to the subtleties Alleyn usually relied upon. Yet even here, the detective detected tension beneath the pedantic exterior. "Dr. Penistone," Alleyn said, "you were speaking with Miss Grey regarding your recent research. Did she object to your enthusiasm?" The scholar blinked, adjusting his spectacles. "Object? Oh, heavens, no. She was curious, I thought. Fascinating girl, but, well, she did not understand the depth of theological nuance. I may have spoken too long, yes, but—" His words trailed off, and Alleyn allowed the silence to speak. Alleyn's attention drifted briefly to the servants, who hovered in corners with discreet attentiveness. Their eyes were sharp, though their words were measured. Alleyn knew they often understood more than they let on. They were careful not to disturb the fragile social equilibrium, yet they observed every gesture, every expression. Finally, he turned to Lady Hermione, who had maintained her composure with remarkable skill. Her eyes, however, flickered occasionally. Subtle hints of concern she did not fully disguise. "Lady Hermione," Alleyn said softly, "Miss Grey seemed to enjoy your company immensely. Did she mention any grievances, even minor, with anyone in the house or among your guests tonight?" Lady Hermione considered him for a moment, her lips pressed together. "Nothing that would matter, Inspector. Complaints in this house are rarely about principle. They are about the petty annoyances of temperament and taste." Alleyn inclined his head. He had heard the words before, but it was the unspoken messages, the flicker of eyes, the hesitation before response, the shift of weight, that spoke loudest. Throughout these interviews, one lesson was quietly reinforced. No one lied outright, and yet each carefully withheld, deflected, or disguised the truth. In such a world, the detective's task was less to extract confession than to understand the spaces between words. He allowed himself a measured sigh, invisible to the assembled company. Social decorum was both a shield and a trap. And tonight, within the golden calm of Haverley House, the trap had already begun to close. Alleyn paused near the fireplace, letting his gaze drift over the room once more. Each guest, each servant, each gesture was a thread. Delicate, subtle, yet capable of weaving a story if one knew where to look. And Alleyn always knew where to look. The household had returned to its quiet rhythm, but a tension lingered in the corridors and stairwells, subtle and persistent. Alleyn moved with deliberate care, accompanied by Mr. Larch, whose composure was unshaken, but whose slight frown betrayed an inner caution. "Sir," Larch murmured as they ascended the main staircase, "I thought it prudent to inform you that the staff has been most cooperative. Yet there is a sense, I must admit, that some knowledge exists which they are loath to share." Alleyn nodded. "That is often the case. Servants witness what their masters and guests might never see. But they are careful, as they should be. Knowledge is a delicate possession, easily mismanaged." They reached the upper landing, where the bedrooms were arranged in a quiet, symmetrical row. The soft hush of the house contrasted sharply with the social activity that had just unfolded, leaving a space in which small gestures spoke loudly. Alleyn glanced at the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, who was arranging linens in the corridor outside the guest rooms. Her hands moved with habitual precision, yet her eyes flicked toward him, betraying both respect and a faint, unspoken apprehension. "Mrs. Fenwick," Alleyn said gently, "you have served Lady Hermione for many years. You know this household intimately. Have you noticed anything unusual this evening? Anything at all, however small?" The housekeeper's hands paused, and she glanced toward the staircase where Larch stood. Her lips pressed together, and her eyes flicked briefly to the closed door of Delphine Gray's former suite. Unusual, she repeated, her voice careful. I suppose one notices much, sir. But what is unusual to one may be commonplace to another, and it is not my place to speak beyond what is required. Alleyn allowed a faint, patient nod. Indeed. Yet sometimes, Mrs. Fenwick, it is precisely the commonplace that reveals the truth. You may have observed something that seemed insignificant, but is, in fact, a vital fragment of understanding. She lowered her eyes, pressing a finger to her lips for a moment. I may have seen small things, sir, but I would not presume to interpret them. There is much that I cannot explain. Alleyn smiled ever so slightly. I do not require interpretation, only observation, simply what you saw or heard. I will make sense of it myself. Her gaze lingered on him for a heartbeat, weighing the trust implicit in his words. Then she spoke, quietly but deliberately. There was a moment, sir, shortly before the guests gathered, when Miss Grey received a note. She was alone, as far as I could see, and she read it with some intensity. She did not speak, nor did she share it. Afterward, she returned to the salon. Alleyn's interest was piqued, though he said nothing aloud, letting the silence carry the weight. A note, discreetly delivered and privately read, that could explain a certain preoccupation, perhaps even fear, though the content remained hidden. "And the staff?" he asked. "Did anyone else notice this?" Mrs. Fenwick shook her head. "No, sir, only I by chance, but even that is limited. I do not pry." "Quite so," Alleyn murmured, his voice calm. "It is precisely your discretion that allows observation to matter." He stepped aside, allowing Mrs. Fenwick to continue her work, and turned to Larch. "Did you see the delivery yourself?" Larch shook his head, brow furrowing slightly. "I did not, sir, but I noted her attention seemed absorbed, yes, absorbed beyond the ordinary. Whatever it was, she hid it well, as one might." Alleyn's gaze drifted along the hallway, toward the quiet, empty rooms. The servants' silence, far from frustrating him, was revealing in itself. They knew, but only partially. They protected the household's decorum while allowing the faintest hints to surface in gestures, hesitations, and glances. Alleyn's mind catalogued each fragment. The note, the careful concealment, the intensity of her reading, and the subtle signals he had observed among the guests. Every small observation was a thread, and already he sensed a pattern forming. Delicate, imperceptible, but undeniably present. "Thank you," he said finally, inclining his head to both Larch and Mrs. Fenwick. "You may return to your duties. I will require you shortly for some further questions. Discretion and calm remain your best allies." As the two servants withdrew, Alleyn allowed himself a brief pause. The household, outwardly calm and composed, concealed fissures deeper than any casual glance could discern. And in those fissures, the seeds of both motive and opportunity were quietly rooted. For Alleyn, the work had only begun. Observation, patience, and the careful unraveling of human restraint. These were his instruments, and the servants, with their quiet vigilance, had provided the first subtle notes in a symphony of revelation yet to come. The morning after Miss Grey's sudden death, Haverley House seemed almost unchanged. The sunlight poured through tall windows, gilding the woodwork and polished floors with a serene brightness that contrasted sharply with the night's quiet horror. Yet for those who observed closely, subtle irregularities betrayed that the household had been unsettled. Alleyn, walking the corridors with measured attention, noted a series of small deviations in what should have been habitual. The morning tea was served before he arrived, which was uncharacteristic. The silver tray had a faint smudge of fingerprints in a place Mr. Larch would ordinarily have polished to perfection. The vases of flowers in the salon were shifted slightly, as though moved in a rush. It was the little things that interested him most. In households of long tradition, there existed rituals, the precise positioning of chairs, the folding of napkins, the arrangement of books and papers. Breaks in ritual were rarely accidental. They were often the telltale footprints of human intention. His attention settled on the breakfast table. The champagne bottle from the previous evening had been removed, of course, but one crystal flute remained, tucked carefully in the corner of the sideboard. A faint ring of residue clung to the base. Alleyn lifted it slightly, noting the subtle lipstick smear along the rim. It was a detail that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But the deviation was significant. The glass had been placed there deliberately, not in the course of clearing the room, but as if to be observed, or perhaps to be avoided. Alleyn's eyes then drifted toward the study, where Lady Hermione often retired for correspondence. The door was ajar, and a faint scent of ink lingered in the air. A letter lay on the desk, partially hidden beneath a blotter. It was clearly recent, the folding precise, the seal still intact. Yet the positioning of the letter, slightly askew, suggested haste in returning it to its place, a break in routine not typical of Lady Hermione's meticulous habits. He noted, too, the behavior of the servants, subtle but consistent. Mrs. Fenwick lingered near the kitchen, her movements measured, her eyes flicking toward the drawing room with an almost imperceptible caution. Larch, polishing the silver, paused briefly as Alleyn approached, as though awaiting a signal, then resumed with precise composure. Both had observed, both had acted, yet both withheld the significance of what they had seen. Alleyn considered the guests as well. Each carried, in their habitual movements, traces of the night's disruption. Adrian Frollo, when he arrived for breakfast, adjusted his tie 3 times before taking his seat, a nervous ritual replacing his usual elegant care. Lord Avilton checked his cufflinks in the mirror more than once. Lady Avilton straightened a drapery rather than her own posture. Small habits, broken and repeated intention, spoke more eloquently than words. He paused at the staircase, letting his gaze drift over the quiet symmetry of the house. The smallest gesture, a shifted vase, an untied ribbon, the placement of a single glass, could carry meaning, revealing the mind's preoccupation in ways that conversation often could not. Then he noticed something more precise. In the corner of the drawing room, beside the sideboard where the leftover champagne glass had been left, lay a tiny fragment of paper, almost imperceptible, as though it had fallen from a folded letter. Alleyn bent to examine it. The edges were sharp, not worn, and a single word could be discerned, written in a careful, feminine hand. Watch. A small clue, perhaps trivial to most, yet in a house governed by ritual and precision, it resonated loudly. Someone had acted deliberately, leaving a trace in a routine otherwise sacrosanct. Someone who understood that observation, as much as action, could carry a message. Alleyn straightened, letting the fragment remain in place for the moment. The pattern was emerging, subtle yet undeniable. Gestures, habits, and deviations all pointed toward intent, carefully concealed, yet telling if one knew where to look. For the inspector, it was confirmation of what he already suspected. The truth lay not in loud confessions or dramatic revelations, but in the quiet, almost invisible alterations of ordinary behavior. In Haverley House, ritual itself had become a language, and someone had spoken. Alleyn made a mental note to trace these deviations with care. The smallest inconsistencies, a glass left in an unusual position, a letter hastily replaced, the subtle tremor of a hand in morning ritual, were the keys to understanding what had truly transpired. And in that understanding, he knew, lay the path to uncovering motive, opportunity, and ultimately, the person behind the tragedy. The calm of the morning had not fully settled over Haverley House before the first tremor of disturbance appeared. Alleyn, having catalogued the subtle deviations in routine, now turned his attention to the lingering tensions among the guests and household. It was during the mid-morning tea that the first quiet upheaval occurred. Adrian Frollo, who had remained uncomfortably subdued during breakfast, received a visitor in the corridor. A brief note delivered in Lady Hermione's unmistakably elegant handwriting. The painter's face, normally so carefully composed, paled imperceptibly, his lips pressing into a thin line before he excused himself under the pretext of checking a sketch in his studio. Alleyn observed the departure with the serenity of one who notices without comment. Yet he noted every nuance, the tremor in Frollo's hands, the slight hesitation in his step, the way he glanced repeatedly over his shoulder as if seeking reassurance that no one had witnessed his private agitation. Meanwhile, in the drawing room, Lady Avelton experienced a quiet, internal collapse of her own. She had been arranging a small collection of photographs on a side table, a ritual she performed with meticulous care, when she discovered one she did not remember placing. It was a snapshot of Delphine Gray, smiling, holding a folded note that had vanished the previous evening. Her fingers hovered, unable to touch the photograph for fear of disturbing some hidden meaning, and a faint blush colored her cheeks. Alleyn, seated nearby under the pretense of reading a morning newspaper, noticed the gesture, the fleeting unease that ran beneath her practiced composure. Even the staff exhibited subtle tremors in the household routine. Mrs. Fenwick, in arranging the silverware for lunch, paused mid-motion as if recalling some details she could neither share nor fully suppress. Larch, polishing the brass in the hallway, allowed a small exhalation, barely audible, that betrayed a quiet anxiety he would not otherwise display. Alleyn, observing all of this, permitted a soft acknowledgement to himself. The house was fracturing, almost imperceptibly, under the weight of a second disturbance. It was not violence nor overt confrontation that caused this. It was knowledge. And knowledge, when contained and fragmented, can be far more corrosive than the loudest scandal. The painter, returning from his studio, carried the note loosely in his hand. He moved with a careful avoidance of eye contact, yet Alleyn's keen observation noted the fine tremors in his grip. The note had evidently contained information that stirred some buried anxiety, or perhaps dread, and the small private disturbance had been witnessed by no one but Alleyn. Across the room, Lady Hermione approached the window, her expression calm but her hands pressed lightly together. She had noted the subtle agitation in several guests, yet did not comment aloud. In her house, discretion was paramount, and the unspoken was often more potent than the spoken. Alleyn allowed, the moment to persist, understanding that revelation through observation was far more telling than interrogation at this stage. Each gesture, each pause, each carefully maintained expression of composure was itself a clue. Finally, as the morning light slanted through the tall windows and gilded the furniture with gentle radiance, Alleyn noted Lord Avelton's behavior. He had taken up the study of a small leather-bound book, a volume he often pretended to read when feeling socially cornered. Yet his gaze continually flicked toward Adrian Frollo. Something had unsettled him as well, though, as with the others. It was muted, internalized, almost polite in its expression. Alleyn's observation was precise. The household, previously calm under the illusion of decorum, was now in motion under the weight of unseen knowledge and restrained anxiety. The small disturbances, the note, the photograph, the tremor in a hand, were not random. They were silent signals, discreetly forming a pattern. And in that quiet, almost invisible agitation, Alleyn recognized the pulse of a mystery deepening. It was not a storm, not yet, but a subtle stirring that, left unchecked, would gradually fracture even the most elegant of veneers. For a detective such as Alleyn, this was precisely the point at which understanding began. When human behavior, unguarded and spontaneous, whispered truths that no spoken word could convey. By mid-afternoon, Haverley House had settled into a peculiar calm, a quiet, after the first tremors of agitation. The household moved through its routines with careful attention, and the guests occupied themselves with gentle conversation, though the laughter had grown thinner, more restrained. Alleyn observed it all with his usual measured detachment, his mind attending to the invisible currents beneath the surface. He did not speak to anyone immediately, nor did he seek to impose questions where none were yet necessary. Instead, he walked slowly through the rooms, retracing his previous observations. The fallen champagne glass, the fragment of paper with its single word, the displaced photograph. Each detail settled in his mind like fine dust, accumulating into an image only he could discern. Alleyn considered the guests, the household, and the rhythms of their interaction. Adrian Frollo had retreated to his studio again, though not entirely to work. His anxiety lingered in the subtle stiffness of his shoulders and the tension in his fingers. Lady Avelton's composure remained immaculate, yet he noted the occasional flicker of her gaze toward Lord Avelton, as if silently questioning some private knowledge. The general, for his part, observed without participation a subtle distance maintained between himself and the ripples of tension. Alleyn paused at the drawing-room window, allowing the afternoon light to illuminate the delicate dust motes in the air. He let his attention drift to the minutiae, the precise alignment of the silver trays, the faint smudge along the edge of a sideboard, the folded letters, and the absent notes of Miss Grey now scattered through the house. These small, almost imperceptible details were, in his experience, the language of human intent. It was here, in these silent, measured observations, that Alleyn's intuition began to clarify. He did not yet know the precise act that had ended Delphine Grey's life, nor the identity of the individual responsible, but he could feel the contours of motive and opportunity. The gestures of avoidance, the careful concealment of anxiety, the subtle fractures in routine. All were part of a pattern. He turned toward the servants, whose quiet attentiveness remained constant. Mrs. Fenwick and Larch were reliable in their discretion, yet the faint hesitation in their movements, the fleeting glances toward certain guests, suggested they knew more than they would ever articulate. Alleyn did not need explicit testimony at this moment. Knowledge had a way of revealing itself in unguarded posture, in rhythm, and in the avoidance of scrutiny. Alleyn's attention returned to the fragment of paper with the single word, watch. It had seemed trivial at first glance, yet now it resonated with quiet significance. Someone had acted deliberately, leaving a trace meant to communicate, or perhaps to mislead. The handwriting, the deliberate placement, the timing, all were notes in a larger, unspoken composition. He allowed himself a small, private smile, though it did not touch his eyes. The pieces were beginning to coalesce, not in a rush of insight, but in the quiet settling of accumulated observation. The truth, as always, was embedded in behavior rather than in confession, in the spaces between words rather than in their utterance. Alleyn walked slowly back toward the drawing-room, where the guests remained, politely engaged, yet subtly uneasy. The rhythm of their social interaction was like a chord played too sharply, harmonious on the surface, but resonant with tension beneath. He noted which gestures were rehearsed, which expressions were genuine, and which were tempered by fear, guilt, or self-interest. At this point, Alleyn did not speak of accusation. He merely catalogued, considered, and allowed his intuition, that patient, deliberate faculty honed over years of observation, to settle like dust over the room. Each detail, each nuance, each fleeting hesitation became part of an invisible map, one which, when traced carefully, would reveal the architecture of the crime. In such households, Alleyn knew, clarity emerged not from confrontation, but from patience, and from the quiet unraveling of the human tendency to conceal. The clues were not dramatic. They were small, subtle, and almost invisible. And yet, in their accumulation, they formed a path toward inevitability. Alleyn settled into his chair near the window, watching the household continue its careful, subdued choreography. The day was far from over, and yet, quietly, imperceptibly, the outlines of understanding were taking shape. He did not speak, did not prompt, did not prod. He waited, as always, allowing observation and intuition to converge. And in that waiting, Alleyn knew the moment of revelation would come. Not with a shout, but with the gentle, precise unfolding of truth. By the late afternoon, Haverly House had settled into a fragile equilibrium. The guests occupied themselves with quiet diversions. A book here, a faintly forced conversation there, yet Alleyn observed the subtle fissures beneath the veneer of civility. There were no overt outbursts, no raised voices, and yet tension lingered in the air, perceptible in the careful distance maintained between certain pairs and the rehearsed gestures of politeness that no longer carried ease. Alleyn, after a measured pause, decided that discretion would serve better than public confrontation. He rose from his chair by the window and motioned to Mr. Larch. "Please have Miss Gray's studio prepared. I wish to speak privately with Mr. Frollo." The painter appeared moments later, hesitant and deferential, yet unable to conceal the faint tremor in his hands. Alleyn did not offer immediate comfort. Instead, he allowed the silence to fill the room, permitting the painter to acknowledge, in his own mind, the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Frollo," Alleyn began, his voice even and courteous, "I understand that you were close to Miss Gray, perhaps closer than many might have suspected." Adrian's lips pressed together. I cared for her, Inspector. I would not harm her." Alleyn inclined his head. "Nor would I presume to suggest otherwise. Yet there are questions that must be answered. Small ones, perhaps, seemingly trivial, yet significant in their implications." He allowed his eyes to travel over the studio, noting the sketches, the paints, the careful arrangement of brushes, all habitual, all precise. "Your routines are meticulous, Mr. Frollo. And yet last evening, a note disturbed her attention. You were aware of it?" The painter's face betrayed a flash of recognition, quickly masked. "I saw nothing, sir. Only afterward did I notice her expression change. That was all." Alleyn's gaze softened slightly, though his observation remained sharp. Miss Gray received information that affected her deeply. That much is apparent. The question is whether it was intended for her alone, or whether it has implications for others in the house. Adrian hesitated, and Alleyn allowed the silence to press gently, like a hand resting upon a wound that would not yet be exposed. "You have no idea who would wish her harm?" Alleyn asked, in a tone that carried neither accusation nor alarm. I cannot imagine," Frollo whispered. Alleyn's eyes studied him, noting the faint irregularity in his posture, the way his fingers clutched at the fabric of his coat. These were not proof, not yet, but they were fragments. Behavior, after all, rarely lies. When the conversation concluded, Alleyn permitted a nod of acknowledgement and motioned for Frollo to return to the drawing room. There was no dramatic pronouncement, no confrontation designed to elicit confession. Instead, the exchange had been quiet, measured, a gentle yet firm delineation that observation alone often reveals more than questions pressed aggressively. Later, Alleyn returned to the main drawing room. The guests remained calm, their composure meticulously maintained, though subtle signs of unease persisted. A hand lightly trembling as it held a cup of tea, a gaze flicking too quickly toward the mantelpiece, a soft sigh when no one was listening. All these details filled the room with an invisible tension. Lady Hermione observed him closely, her expression unchanging, yet a faint quiver in her posture betrayed her awareness that Alleyn had been active in private inquiry. "You move among us like a shadow, Inspector," she said softly. Alleyn inclined his head, letting the compliment pass without comment. Observation is often quiet, Lady Hermione. The truth, when it emerges, prefers to do so without fanfare. He allowed himself a final survey of the room. Nothing was overt. Everything was subtle. Every guest's behavior, every carefully maintained gesture contributed to a map of intention and anxiety. He did not yet know the entire path to revelation, but the shape of it was becoming visible in the smallest of signs. In the calm of the late afternoon, Alleyn permitted himself a moment to reflect. The house, outwardly serene, had already begun to disclose its secrets. It was only a matter of patience, of continued observation, and of following the quiet fractures that life had created in this otherwise elegant facade. Evening had descended upon Haverley House, the sunlight replaced by the mellow glow of lamps and candles. Shadows lay delicately along the cornices and mouldings, moving as though they were part of the household itself, carrying secrets in their quiet folds. Alleyn, having observed, reflected, and noted the subtlest of signals, gathered the key figures in the drawing-room once more. Lady Hermione sat with her usual poise, though her fingers, folded neatly in her lap, betrayed the faintest tension. The guests, restrained and composed, had acquiesced to his quiet request that they remain, understanding in some unspoken way that the answers were about to arrive. Not with spectacle, but with calm deliberation. Alleyn began softly, his voice measured, almost conversational. This is a house of habit, of meticulous routines and careful gestures, and it is within these routines that the truth often hides. He paused, letting the words settle in the room. Miss Grey's death was neither violent nor chaotic. It was precise, deliberate, and quiet. Much like life itself in this household, elegant, restrained, and, at times, merciless in its discretion. His eyes swept the room, noting the slight flinches, the subtle exchanges of glances, the hesitations that only refined anxiety could produce. Some of you, I have observed, are aware of small deviations, of moments that seemed insignificant but were not. The note she received, the fragment of paper with its single word, the tempered anxiety we have all witnessed, these were the markers of intention. Alleyn turned to Lord Appleton, whose hand had unconsciously gripped the armrest of his chair a moment too tightly. You sought to conceal your involvement, yet one cannot entirely mask one's gestures, especially when the heart is concerned. Lord Appleton's composure remained, yet his lips tightened imperceptibly. The note, Alleyn continued, addressing the room at large, was crafted not to threaten, but to ensure observation. The individual responsible understood, as all in this house must, that small details convey more than words, and it is these details, unnoticed by all but the most attentive, that reveal truth. He paused, allowing the quiet to deepen. It was you, Lady Appleton, he said softly, turning his gaze upon her. Your careful manipulations, the note, the photograph left in its particular place, and the subtle adjustments of Miss Grey's attention, all were intended to direct perception, to control understanding. Your motive was rooted not in passion nor malice alone, but in the delicate architecture of social and personal advantage. Lady Appleton's expression shifted, not in denial, but in recognition. A faint exhalation escaped her lips, barely audible, as though relief and resignation were intertwined. She did not speak, and Alleyn did not press her. Words were unnecessary. The truth had already settled among them, unspoken yet irrefutable. Alleyn turned briefly to the assembled guests. Justice is not always dramatic. Sometimes it manifests in the quiet acknowledgement of consequence, in the careful weighing of guilt and responsibility. The social order, once disrupted, cannot easily return to its former symmetry. Yet in understanding, we find the clarity denied by panic. He allowed the room to absorb the calm precision of his words. The tragedy of Miss Grey's death was complete, yet its revelation was tempered with civility. There were no accusations shouted, No hysteria, just recognition, subtle and inevitable. Lady Hermione inclined her head ever so slightly, as if to acknowledge the resolution. Alleyn, for his part, noted the calm that had returned, tenuous yet present, and allowed himself a private reflection on the patterns of human behavior he had observed. The culprit's identity was known, the motive understood, and yet the elegance of restraint remained unbroken. The house, the guests, the servants, all carried on within the same polished framework, now tinged with the quiet knowledge that deception and tragedy had passed through their midst. Alleyn, seated once more near the window, allowed the lamplight to illuminate the room. The shadows, long and gentle, seemed to settle with him, as though in agreement with his understanding. Truth, he knew, could be revealed softly, without spectacle, and still leave a mark far deeper than any public drama could achieve. And in the hushed elegance of Heverly House, the resolution had arrived. Silent, precise, and irrevocable. The following morning, Heverly House exuded its usual calm, though it was a calm tinged with the quiet tension of inevitability. Alleyn walked the corridors slowly, observing not only the guests but the household itself, aware that consequence, like shadow, lingers even when the light appears restored. Lady Avelton, discreetly summoned to the library, had already accepted the weight of her actions. There was no defiance in her posture, no impetuous protest. She acknowledged the subtle revelation of Alleyn's insight with a faint, measured bow of understanding. In her eyes lay the recognition that civility and social performance, though carefully maintained, could not shield one from moral consequence. The servants moved with calm diligence, though the knowledge they had long harbored was now refracted through quiet resignation. Mrs. Fenwick and Larch observed the household with the same precise care, aware that they were still custodians of its proprieties even as justice, in its own subdued manner, unfolded. Alleyn noted with characteristic precision that punishment need not always be public to be effective. Lady Avelton would face scrutiny, restraint, and the inevitable reflection upon her motives and acts, consequences that would shape her conduct more profoundly than any outward censure. The law, in this instance, required neither spectacle nor fanfare. The moral architecture of society itself, quietly reinforced, was sufficient. The guests, too, absorbed the subtle weight of consequence. Adrian Frollo returned to his studio, brushes and paper awaiting him, though his movements carried a new awareness that even the most delicate gestures might have implications far beyond the intended design. Lord and Lady Avelton moved with a careful grace, their social interactions shaded now by the unspoken recognition of what had transpired. Alleyn observed this quiet redistribution of awareness and allowed himself a small acknowledgement of the inevitability that accompanies well-mannered justice. The household, outwardly elegant and composed, had absorbed the shock of revelation in silence. No dramatics, no shouting, no overt punishment, only the internal reckoning that accompanies responsibility. Even the room in which Delphine Gray had been found remained unchanged. The champagne glass, now removed, and the faint trace of her presence lingering in the air like a memory. Alleyn understood that the true measure of consequence was often unseen, residing in conscience, in hesitation, and in the delicate recalibration of human interaction. Justice, in its finest form, Alleyn murmured to himself, is rarely theatrical. It is quiet, inevitable, and measured by the very society it protects. The household, restored to its routines yet altered subtly by reflection, carried on with impeccable propriety. Yet Alleyn sensed the undercurrent of irony in the scene. Civility and elegance had endured, even flourished, while the moral center of the household had been quietly corrected. It was a paradox that only those attuned to the delicate intricacies of human behavior could fully appreciate. And in this subtle equilibrium, Alleyn recognized the enduring pattern of his work. Lives disrupted, secrets revealed, and the quiet hand of consequence wielded with precision. There was no applause, no acknowledgement, only the silent reinforcement of responsibility and restraint. The house and its occupants would never be quite the same. Yet the dignity of observation, the power of restraint, and the inevitability of moral reckoning had been preserved, a justice as elegant and unspoken as the lives it governed. The evening settled over Haverley House with a gentle hush, the lamps casting a warm, mellow glow upon the polished floors and gilt-edged furniture. Alleyn, seated in the drawing-room near the window, allowed his gaze to drift over the quiet tableau of the household. The guests had retired to their rooms or quietly resumed conversation, and even the servants moved with subdued grace, aware that the day's revelations had left a mark no decorum could entirely conceal. He reflected on the intricate pattern of human behavior that had unfolded before him. Each gesture, hesitation, and carefully maintained smile had spoken volumes. Every fragment of paper, every small disturbance in ritual, had carried the weight of intent. It was, Alleyn mused, a language that required no words, only attention, patience, and the cultivated sensitivity to observe without judgment. The tragedy of Delphine Gray remained, of course, and the house still bore the faint echoes of her absence. Yet there was also, beneath the sadness, a kind of order restored, not through confrontation or spectacle, but through quiet understanding and subtle consequence. The culprit had been revealed, the patterns of motive and action traced, and justice, measured and civil, had taken its due course. Alleyn's thoughts wandered to the nature of human civility. In households such as this, he knew, elegance often masked fracture, politeness frequently concealed motive. Yet it was precisely this polished surface that made the fractures legible to one who could perceive them. Observation was not merely a tool of investigation, but a lens through which the human condition could be discerned, with all its contradictions, restraint, and inevitable truth. He allowed himself a faint, private smile, the kind reserved for the quiet satisfaction of understanding rather than triumph. There would be no applause, no accolades, only the slow, deliberate unfolding of lives now altered by knowledge and consequence, and that, in its own restrained manner, was sufficient. Alleyn rose and walked to the window, looking out at the fading light that softened the contours of the gardens below. The shadows lengthened, gentle and patient, settling over the world with a calm inevitability. He thought of the small clues, the subtle gestures, the quiet disturbances, and the disciplined patience that had allowed him to perceive the truth. All of it, he realized, was a testament not to the violence of human nature, but to its careful, deliberate fragility. As night fell, the house exhaled softly, the quiet rhythms of Haverley resuming their course. Alleyn remained for a moment longer, attentive, observing the delicate interplay of light and shadow. In the stillness, he understood once more that mysteries were never solved by haste or theatrics. They revealed themselves to those who waited, who watched, and who comprehended the subtleties of human intent. Finally, he allowed the drawing-room to empty in his mind, leaving only the interplay of light, shadow, and memory. A quiet sigh of satisfaction passed through him, not triumph, not relief, but recognition. For in the subtle fractures of civility and in the delicate patterns of conduct lay the truest understanding of life and its inevitable consequences. Alleyn turned from the window and, in the soft glow of lamplight, allowed the day to settle into history. The house, its occupants, and the quiet echoes of tragedy would continue onward, and he, as always, would remain a careful observer, patient, precise, and quietly vigilant. For some truths, he reflected, required no fanfare to endure. They simply existed, like shadows that follow the setting sun, inevitable and quietly illuminating all that they touched.